Police offers, what are your most terrifying paranormal encounters? I was patrolling a quiet residential area on a late shift, sometime around 2 a.m. I stopped at a red light near a small park when I saw a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing at the edge of the playground. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress and just staring at me, not moving. I immediately thought it was strange for a child to be out so late, so I pulled over to check on her. As soon as I stepped out of the car and looked back at the playground, she was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere, and the park was surrounded by a fence with only one entrance, which was still locked. I even searched the area thinking maybe she wandered off, but it was as if she vanished into thin air. We got a call from a lady in a small town who lived alone in an old house. She said she kept hearing whispers at night, and she felt like someone was watching her. We figured it was probably the wind or the house settling, but we went out anyway. When we got there, the place had a weird feeling like the air was heavy. As we walked through the house, my partner and I heard faint whispering, too, coming from upstairs. We both headed up, but the second we reached the top, it stopped. There was no one there and no windows open. We tried to reassure the woman, but when we were leaving, she said, "He doesn't like it when you're here." We asked who he was, and she just said, "The man who lives in the attic." One night, I was called to a crash on a rural highway. The car had gone off the road and hit a tree. The driver was unconscious, but alive. While waiting for the ambulance, I walked around the scene to see if there was anyone else involved. That's when I saw a man standing about 20 feet away from the car, looking at me. I called out to him, thinking he was a witness or a passenger, but he didn't respond. I turned away for a second to radio in, and when I looked back, the man was gone. The area was flat with nowhere for him to hide. When the driver woke up, I asked if anyone else was with him, and he said, "No, but my brother died on this road a year ago." We got a report of strange noises coming from an old house on the outskirts of town. The house had been abandoned for years, but neighbors claimed they could hear someone banging on the walls and screaming at night. My partner and I went to check it out. As soon as we entered the house, we heard loud banging, like someone was slamming a door repeatedly upstairs. We rushed up there, but when we got to the room, it was empty. Suddenly, the banging started again, this time right behind us. We turned around, and the door we had just walked through was now closed. We left pretty quickly after that. I once responded to a welfare check for an elderly woman. Her neighbors hadn't seen her in days, so we were sent to check on her. When we got there, her house was completely locked up, and no one answered the door. I managed to get inside, and the place was in perfect order, but there was no sign of the woman. As I was searching the upstairs, I heard a faint humming coming from one of the bedrooms. I opened the door, and there she was, sitting in a rocking chair, humming quietly to herself. I asked if she was okay, and she just smiled at me and said, "I've been waiting for him." Before I could ask who, the room suddenly got freezing cold. I turned around to leave, and when I looked back at the chair, she was gone. The neighbors later told me she had passed away in that very room 2 days before. I was on a night shift patrolling a mostly deserted industrial area. There were a lot of old factories, and they were all shut down after hours. I parked near one of the buildings to do some paperwork when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It looked like a person walking past one of the factory windows. I got out to investigate, thinking it might be a trespasser. I searched the entire building but found nothing. The weird thing is, the only door into the factory was locked from the inside. There was no way anyone could have been in there. One time, my partner and I got a call from a frantic woman who said she could hear voices in her basement. She was convinced someone had broken in, so we went to check it out. We went down to the basement, and sure enough, there were faint voices echoing through the space. We searched every corner but found nothing and no one. As we were heading back upstairs, the woman pointed to a corner and said, "They're over there." When we looked, there was nothing, but she insisted the voices were coming from that spot. After a few minutes of trying to calm her down, we left, but she called again a few days later, saying the voices were back. I was responding to a call about a possible intruder in an abandoned building. The place was falling apart, with broken windows and graffiti everywhere. As I searched through the rooms, I noticed the temperature dropped significantly in one area of the building. It was the middle of summer, so that was odd. I walked into what looked like an old office and immediately felt like I wasn't alone. The air felt thick, and I swear I could hear breathing, but I was the only one there. I finished my sweep and left as fast as I could. There was this one time I was working the night shift, patrolling a small town with a lot of old Victorian-style houses. I got a call from a guy who said he saw someone standing in his backyard near the tree line. When I arrived, he was visibly shaken. He pointed to where he saw the figure, but no one was there. As I was shining my flashlight around, I caught sight of a person standing just inside the tree line staring at us. I yelled for them to come out, but they turned and walked deeper into the woods. My partner and I followed, but we lost sight of them. We searched for hours, but never found anyone. The homeowner later told us he had seen the same figure multiple times, always in the same spot. One night, I got a call about a woman screaming in an old, abandoned house on the edge of town. The place was known to be haunted, but I didn't believe in that stuff. I went to check it out anyway. As soon as I entered, I heard the screaming clear as day coming from upstairs. I rushed up there, but as soon as I reached the top of the stairs, the screaming stopped. I searched every room, but the house was completely empty. When I got back downstairs, I heard the scream again, this time from outside the house. I ran out, but there was no one there. I still don't know what caused it. I was called to a remote farmhouse after the owner reported hearing strange noises outside his house every night for a week. He lived alone and his nearest neighbor was miles away. When I got there, he was clearly terrified. He told me the noises were always the same footsteps circling his house, but when he checked, no one was ever there. That night, we sat in the dark, waiting. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps too, crunching in the gravel around the house. I rushed outside with my flashlight, but as soon as I stepped out, the noise stopped. There were no tracks in the gravel, no sign that anyone had been there. I stayed until sunrise, but we never found anything. A few years ago, I got a call about someone hearing children laughing in an abandoned school building. The place had been shut down for decades, and there were rumors about it being haunted, but we still had to check it out. When I arrived, I could hear faint giggling coming from one of the upper floors. I figured it was probably some kids messing around. As I walked through the halls, the laughter seemed to follow me, always just out of reach. When I finally made it to the top floor, the sound stopped completely. I searched every room but found no one. To this day, I don't like going near that building. There's a notorious old house in my town that's been abandoned for years. People say it's haunted, but I never gave it much thought. One night, I was driving by on patrol when I saw a light on in one of the windows. I figured it was probably kids sneaking in, so I went to check it out. When I got inside, the place was dark again, but I could hear faint whispers, like multiple people talking in the next room. I opened the door to the room, but it was empty. As I was leaving, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, like a shadow darting across the hallway. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I responded to a call from an elderly man who said he kept seeing someone standing in his garden at night. When I got there, he pointed out where he'd seen the figure, but there was no one around. As I was talking to him, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A dark figure was standing near the edge of his property, just watching us. When I turned my flashlight on it, the figure disappeared. The man told me he'd seen it every night for the past week. I patrolled the area for the rest of my shift, but never saw it again. One night, I was sitting in my patrol car on a break when I saw what looked like a woman in a long dress walking down the side of the road. I figured she needed help, so I got out to check on her, but when I got closer, she was gone. The road was completely empty, and there was nowhere for her to have gone. I got back in my car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. We were responding to a call about strange noises coming from a warehouse that had been empty for years. When we arrived, we heard banging coming from inside like someone was throwing things around. We figured it was probably squatters, so we went in to clear the building. The noises kept getting louder, but every time we entered a room, it would go silent. After an hour of searching, we found no one, but the noises continued even after we left. There was this old hotel on the edge of town that had been shut down for decades. People always said it was haunted, but no one had any real proof. One night, we got a call about lights flickering on and off inside. My partner and I went to check it out. The place was creepy old furniture covered in dust, cobwebs everywhere. As we walked through the lobby, we heard footsteps upstairs. We rushed up, thinking maybe some kids had broken in, but the second we got to the top of the stairs, the footsteps stopped. We searched the whole building and didn't find anyone, but the feeling that someone was watching us never went away. A few years back, I was working the graveyard shift in a rural area when I got a call about a woman standing on the side of the road, just staring out into the fields. I arrived at the location, and sure enough, there was a woman in a long white dress, just standing there. I pulled up beside her and asked if she needed help, but she didn't respond or even acknowledge me. I got out of the car, and as I approached her, she turned and walked into the field. I followed her with my flashlight, but after about 20 feet, she disappeared. There was nowhere for her to go, just open fields for miles. I looked around for a while, but she was gone. One time I was called to a domestic disturbance in a house that was known for weird happenings. The homeowner said they heard someone whispering their name, but no one else was in the house. I arrived, and being skeptical, I checked every room thoroughly. Nothing. As I was about to leave, I heard someone whisper my name from the direction of the basement. I froze, then checked the basement, but of course, it was empty. I didn't stick around much longer after that. There's this old bridge on the edge of our town that's been the subject of ghost stories for years. People say they see a man walking on the bridge at night, but when they stop to offer him a ride, he disappears. One night, I was patrolling near that bridge when I saw someone standing right in the middle of it. I slowed down and got out to check if they needed help, but as I got closer, they just faded away. The creepiest part. I've since heard several other officers have had the same experience at the same spot. I once got a call about a woman hearing footsteps in her attic. She lived alone and was terrified, so I went over to check it out. The attic door was a pull-down ladder type, and as soon as I opened it, I heard what sounded like heavy footsteps moving around above me. I climbed up to take a look, and as soon as I poked my head through the opening, the footsteps stopped. The attic was empty. There was no one up there, and no other way out. The woman told me that every night since she moved in, she had heard those same footsteps. I was called to an old, abandoned mental hospital on the outskirts of town. Teens like to sneak in and explore, so we occasionally had to clear the place out. When I got there, it was dead silent. I started walking the halls, and out of nowhere, I heard a woman crying. I followed the sound to an old room that still had some of the original equipment in it, but no one was there. The crying stopped as soon as I entered the room. It felt like I had walked into a freezer, and the air was so thick it was hard to breathe. I got out of there as quickly as I could. I had a shift working overnight security at a small town cemetery for a few months. There had been reports of vandalism, so they wanted someone to keep an eye on the place. One night, I was walking through the graveyard when I saw what looked like a woman in a long black dress standing by a gravestone. I called out to her, thinking maybe she was visiting a grave, but she didn't respond. When I got closer, she just disappeared. It freaked me out because there was no place for her to go, just rows of headstones. I ended up quitting that post a few weeks later. I was called to a disturbance at a small house in a very old neighborhood. The owner said he kept hearing banging noises from the basement, but every time he checked, there was no one there. I went down to take a look, and the air was freezing cold despite it being summer. As I was searching, I heard a loud thud behind me, like something heavy had been dropped. When I turned around, a shelf had fallen over, even though there was nothing near it that could have caused it to fall. The owner said it wasn't the first time it had happened. He moved out not long after. I responded to a report of a break-in at a house that had been abandoned for years. When I got there, I saw lights flickering inside. I figured maybe some kids had broken in, but when I got inside, it was completely empty. The weird thing is, there was no power to the house. I checked the breaker box, and it was completely disconnected. Still, the lights continued to flicker on and off as I walked through the house. I didn't hang around long after that. We were called to an old church that had been abandoned for decades. The place had a history of strange occurrences, but this time, someone reported seeing figures moving around inside. We went to check it out, and as we were walking through the main hall, I saw what looked like a person standing near the altar. I called out, but they didn't move. As we got closer, the figure just vanished. My partner saw it too, and to this day, neither of us can explain what we saw. I was working in a small town where there were rumors of an old mansion being haunted. People said they'd seen shadows moving in the windows at night, but no one had lived there for years. One night, I got a call about strange noises coming from the mansion. When I arrived, the house was dark, but as soon as I stepped inside, I heard footsteps upstairs. I went to investigate, but every room was empty. As I was leaving, I heard what sounded like whispering coming from behind me. When I turned around, no one was there. I responded to a 911 call from an elderly man who said there were people in his house. He was frantic and said they were trying to get him. When I got there, the house was empty, but the man insisted they had just been there, standing in his hallway. He described them as shadowy figures that didn't speak, just stood there, watching him. I searched the house and found nothing, but the man was so terrified that I ended up staying with him for a while. As I was about to leave, he looked at the doorway and whispered, "They're back." I turned to look, but there was nothing there. I was doing a routine patrol near a forested area when I saw headlights in the distance. I figured it was a car on one of the back roads, but as I got closer, the lights disappeared. I searched the area and found tire tracks leading into the woods, but they just stopped after about 50 feet. There was no sign of a car, and the tracks didn't lead anywhere. It was like the car had just vanished into thin air. One night, I was patrolling near an old factory that had been abandoned for years. As I drove by, I saw someone standing in one of the windows just staring out at the street. I turned around to check it out, but by the time I got there, the window was empty. I went inside to investigate, but the place was completely deserted. Other officers have reported seeing the same thing over the years, a figure standing in that same window, always disappearing when someone gets close. We got a call about strange lights in a field near an old farmhouse. When I arrived, I saw what looked like glowing orbs floating above the ground. At first, I thought it might be some kind of prank, but as I got closer, the orbs disappeared. There was no one around and no way to explain what I had just seen. The weird thing is, that same field has been the site of several other reports of strange lights over the years. One of the creepiest calls I ever responded to was a report of loud banging sounds coming from an abandoned house. The place had been empty for years, so I figured it was just the wind or maybe an animal inside. As I walked through the house, the banging got louder and louder, but every time I checked a room, it was empty. At one point, I opened a door to what looked like an old bedroom, and all the noise stopped. The room was freezing cold, and I could see my breath even though it was the middle of summer. I didn't stay long after that. We got a call from a homeowner who said he kept seeing shadows moving around his house at night. He lived alone and was convinced someone was sneaking into his house. We checked the place out and everything seemed normal, but as we were leaving, I saw a dark shape move across the hallway out of the corner of my eye. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, but the homeowner looked at me and said, "You saw it too, didn't you?" I was patrolling a desolate stretch of highway late at night when I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. I slowed down and rolled down my window to ask if they needed help, but they didn't respond. When I got out of the car and approached, the figure just vanished into the darkness. I searched the area, but there was no one around. To this day, I still can't explain it. There was this one time I was called to check on a suspicious person walking around an old cemetery. When I arrived, the place was empty, but as I was walking through the rows of headstones, I saw someone in a dark cloak standing near the back of the cemetery. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. As I got closer, the figure just disappeared. I searched the area, but there was no sign of anyone. One of the most unsettling experiences I've had was responding to a call about a woman hearing footsteps in her house late at night. She lived alone and said, the footsteps were coming from her attic. I went to check it out, and as I climbed the stairs, I could clearly hear someone walking around up there. When I opened the door, the attic was empty, and the footsteps stopped. The woman moved out of the house a few months later because the footsteps never went away.